And I welcome you all for coming here and the work that you do. I'm going to circle in on housing for all, and I look at all the different agencies that you've mentioned. And if you just focus on the LDA at the moment, for the area that I represent, the LDA does nothing for me, because the LDA, all their funding is based in the city. It doesn't base itself within the county because of the infrastructure issue that we have in Limerick. So when I look at funding and housing for all, it doesn't cover housing for all, because in the county areas where I'm living in, so geographically, LDA would support something within 15 minutes of the city, but geographically Limerick City is in a corner and the county falls out from it. So you could be looking at 40 odd miles by the time you get to Ballylanders, and then 40 odd miles by the time you get to Abbeyfield, which the funding, because of infrastructure, is very weak. So when you go to the repair and lease scheme, which could actually help, but again, the repair and lease scheme will help because it's based on the existing infrastructure that's there, even though they're at their max capacity. At least it will help that. But from the point of view of new builds, and you talk about funding, how much of your funding has actually gone to areas outside of the cities for housing? Because in Limerick, it can't go there because of the lack of infrastructure. So how do I have housing for all in Limerick? And I welcome the money that's been spent in the city, because it's welcomed and we have to house people. But I also want to welcome, how do I make my towns and villages sustainable and put people into my houses in towns and villages? And I'm in from construction myself, and I've been in construction all my life. And when you be talking about the loans that you're giving out, I can't understand how you can actually justify the loans when it comes to inflation, because the price of housing has gone up by between 70 odd euros a square foot in an 18-month period. And I know this from a daily basis because I'm dealing in construction myself on a daily basis. And I find it hard when I'm in construction. You could price something today and tomorrow it's different. Your labour content, your material content, everything is moving at a fast pace. So for your own security, for your own funding, so if you're lending 150 million to a project, that 150 million now is turned into 250 million. How do you counteract to make sure that these projects last? And we've seen during the week where we saw Robridge going into receivership. Perfect example of how do we future-proof. But my biggest question I have for you, committee here, and you mentioned on that you have so many teams. How many of your teams can help me rebuild County Limerick from the lack of infrastructure that we have traditionally from generations of government, and the failure of local authorities in investing and improving infrastructure, sewerage and water, so I can rebuild towns and villages. If I rebuild towns and villages to a larger scale, I can then make a case to have the proper infrastructure for transport from hubs of towns that I can rebuild, which can bring in the villages around them. So it also improves for emissions going forward. It also gives me a case study that I can fight for transport infrastructure from hubs such as the likes of Kilmallock, such as the likes of Drumculloher, such as the likes of Abbeyfield, Newcastle West, that I can actually put in hub towns that can be invested in, and they can actually have a 15-minute window outside of them that they can bring in the villages and provide infrastructure for those people, which also brings business to my towns and villages, which brings people to my towns and villages, which future-proofs housing for all for County Limerick. So could you tell me how you can help me in County Limerick?
For Mr. Jordan.
For anyone of the team that can help me.
I'll go to Mr. Jordan first and then to Mr. Jordan. Yeah.
So I suppose in relation to Limerick City and County, just to be clear about the number of roles that we have. So we do have a projects and procurement team within the agency that provides technical support to both local authorities and AHBs. So what I see here is that we have been helping a number of voluntary housing associations in the area, Adapt, Groom, Cappamore and so on, Focus Ireland. We also have land in Limerick, and we've transferred some of that land to Limerick City and County Council and indeed to Clwyd Housing and so on. So that's another way of supporting delivery. I suppose the other thing is the 70 million acquisitions fund that I mentioned earlier. We have been acquiring properties that have been provided for social housing there, both directly on behalf of the local authorities and on behalf of AHBs. So I suppose, there are particular functions, Deputy, but, you can see that going forward, I suppose, we will have a role in relation to this town centre first policy, and certainly we'll be supporting local authorities and AHBs to help reanimate towns and villages, including bringing vacant and derelict commercial and residential buildings back
But I
into use.
understand from that point of view, but from new builds, for me to get extra people into my towns and villages so I can create businesses, which makes the town sustainable, which then can make me a body case that I can ask for infrastructure for the likes of transport bus services to get in there. They're at max capacity, bar 3 of the towns are at max capacity for storage. Skeeton is waiting 37 years for an upgrade in the storage system. That's a Skeeton. Hospitals at max capacity, they've actually had to put in, to build new houses, they had to put on-site storage facilities until it's upgraded. The infrastructure is key to County Limerick being built up, and I do welcome the CPOs on buildings that have been derelict and people have been buying them up and leaving them derelict. I do welcome any investment in those, but I also want to see new builds for new families so I can get infrastructure in place.
Thanks, Deputy. Just to say, conflict of interest declaration, my mother-in-law is from Newcastle West, so I should get that up front.
My mother's Ballylanders, by the way.
All the more reason you can send me money this way.
Invites most of the agencies down to Limerick, so you can visit relations.
You're welcome home.
There'll be no money for Limerick for the foreseeable future until Cork actually beat you in the hurling. Not to worry about that. Just to say to you, we've lent, in the last 5 years, we've lent 118 million to Limerick. Now, I can't tell you what the breakdown between city and county is, but I suppose we could have a reasonable guess that it's city orientated. Yes. I think, as Bob mentioned, the town person above the shop schemes are there. And I think you will see the pandemic delivering people who realise that's where they want to live now because they can do it and work. We will fund any loan application that comes from either Limerick, the local authority, or any of the AHBs, and we do a lot of business with the AHBs in Limerick. Quite happily fund them. You were saying, how do we justify funding them with the cost? You'd have heard many times, I don't need to tell you, that the cost of funding a mortgage or a loan is substantially less than the cost of the rent, and that's how we do it. So we look at the cash flow that's coming back in on us, and when that's enough to fund it, you get the money, and we don't say no.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. O'Leary.